So good afternoon, evening, or maybe even morning for some, and welcome to this Science Policy 101 webinar organized by Euroscience. For those who are not yet familiar with Euroscience, Euroscience is the European Association for the Advancement of Science and Technology. We currently have more than 4,500 members, including researchers and other science professionals, such as policymakers, teachers, communicators, and journalists from over 75 countries, from both public and private sectors. With such a diverse community, Euroscience represents and empowers individual researchers and science professionals independently of their institutions and/or employers. And we reflect and debate collectively on science, society, and the science professions. This is important because in a world of constant change, like I think we've all seen in the last 2 years, society requires a critical understanding of what science is, what science professionals do, and how their work is evolving. So if you want to get to know more about Euroscience, please visit the website euroscience.org and consider joining the next Euroscience Open Forum, where we debate on science in, with, and for society. The next one will be held from 13th to 16th of July in Leiden in the Netherlands. And so for today, we will have a panel discussion about how scientists can interact with policymakers with 3 experts on science for policy. We have Alessandro Allegra from the European Commission Science Advice Mechanism. We have Naomi Saints. Hey. We have Naomi Saints from the UK Parliament Knowledge Exchange Unit, and Tycho van Houwaert, who's working on industry and circular economy topics at Bond Beter Leefmilieu. So maybe we can start with, maybe it's better if you introduce yourselves and your role at your institution and what your institution does. Maybe Alessandro, we can start with you.
Sure. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alessandro Allegra. I'm a policy officer at the European Commission, working in the scientific advice mechanism. Scientific advice mechanism connects scientists and policymakers in the European Commission, and is composed of 3 parts. One is the group of chief scientific advisors, which is 7 senior scientists who provide scientific advice to the political leadership of the European Commission. The second part is the SAPEA network of scientific academies across Europe, which provides the evidence reviews that inform the scientific advice. And then there is a team at the European Commission, which I'm part of, which provides the support to the whole scientific advice mechanism. And our role is very much that of being in between, in a way, with one foot in the policy community within the European Commission institutions. Well, I wouldn't say one foot in the scientific world, but definitely looking towards the scientific world and working closely with the scientific world to broker scientific knowledge into policymaking. And well, maybe we can go into a bit more detail later, but my role is very much that of being a transmission mechanism in a way between the outside scientific advisors and the inside policymakers.
Okay, awesome. Let's get deeper into that a bit later. Naomi, could you?
Hello, hi everyone. Thank you so much for being here and inviting me. So I'm Naomi. I work at the UK Parliament. I'm part of the Knowledge Exchange Unit at the UK Parliament. We're based in the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology. And we work to support researchers and the research sector in the UK to contribute expertise to the UK Parliament. And we also support staff at the UK Parliament to find and use research and expertise when they need it. So I guess a little bit like Alessandro, I'm a transmission mechanism between the research sector in the UK and the UK Parliament. So just to tell you a few different ways that we do that, we provide training and resources for researchers on how to engage with the UK Parliament. We run academic fellowships at UK Parliament. We promote opportunities for researchers to engage with Parliament via our networks and via Twitter. We work with research funders to try and ensure that they understand impact and knowledge exchange in legislatures in the UK. And we're always working to try and understand and work around barriers between researchers and the UK Parliament. We're especially focused on diverse and inclusive engagement from researchers.
Well, you definitely have a lot to do there. What about you, Tycho?
Yeah, hi everyone. Tycho, thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting me. I have a background in science. I'm a geologist, but now working as a policy officer at Bon Beter Leefmilieu, policy officer in industry, team, and circular economy. Bon Beter Leefmilieu is like the Flemish environmental movement. It's a non-governmental organization. We focus on some specific environmental topics like mobility, agriculture, circular economy, spatial planning. We work with companies that are front runners, for example, civil society in general, but also the government. We are also a network organization, so that means that we align our positions with a large network of environmental organizations. And these positions, of course, are based on the science I'm reading. Specifically on industry and circular economy, I'm lobbying for that on the Flemish government level and also the Belgian level, and talking with parliamentaries, for example, has some good contacts with journalists. We show papers, we prove our points, and we make our position known. That's all for now.
All right. So I think my next question for people just joining us new to Science for Policy is how would you explain Science for Policy? And also then for you personally, what is your specific role at the Science Policy interface? I don't know who wants to start on this one, maybe Alessandro, would you like to start?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I would say that very much Science for Policy for us means putting scientific knowledge and advice based on that scientific knowledge at the service of policymakers. So the way we work is that the scientific advice mechanism receives a request for advice from the basically the political leadership of the European Commission, the College of Commissioners. And then we set in motion a process to gather, analyze scientific evidence and knowledge, and the chief scientific advisors give their advice on the basis of that. So it's very much a process of not just providing scientific knowledge, but also doing so in a way that's actually useful and relevant to policymakers. And that's really where my role is important, because I work at the European Commission, so I'm in a way internal to the European civil service, and have access to my colleagues who work on various policy files. Say, the last project I worked on was on biodegradable plastics, and I was in touch with the colleagues who are basically drafting the European framework on plastics. All the single-use plastic ban things you might have heard about, they are the one who actually prepare those pieces of legislation and then go in front of the parliament. And they had requested the chief scientific advisors to provide their advice on the use of biodegradable plastics in the open environment. And my role was being in constant communication with the policy colleagues and with the scientists to make sure that the answers that the scientists were giving were actually useful to the policy colleagues, which does not mean telling them what they want to be told, but telling them something they can actually make use of, something that fits within the context of how they work, the time frames. There is no point in coming up with an amazing report a month after a major policy framework has been launched, or even a week before. It needs to be a long way before. So a lot of our role is to align in a way the timeframes and way of working of the scientific community with those of the policy community that can make use of that evidence and advice.
Okay, thank you. So Naomi, how do you explain Science for Policy, and what role does science play at your institution?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question. I think in POST, the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology at the UK Parliament, I think we'd probably say we understand science in its broadest sense. So we'd probably see it as kind of research evidence on any topic. And so Science for Policy is about bringing research evidence and expertise into the world of policy decision-making and the world of the development of legislation in legislatures and in executives, so in governments and in parliaments. And so my team's role in that is to try and ensure that the UK Parliament can access the best available research evidence when it's needed. So that includes supporting and incentivizing the research sector to provide this, as well as connecting up those working at UK Parliament with the experts that they need.
All right. Tihu, for you, what do you consider to be your role at the science policy interface, and does science play an important role at your institution?
I think it's a really difficult question. I join the answers that I've been told. I think everyone at my institution has like another opinion on science. I think you can use science as you like. I use it to write reports, for example, position papers. So I read articles, I read study work papers, also on modeling and methodology. Innovation really is something that is a topic that I'm focusing on. And what I do is from a paper, you can write another paper, position paper with our opinion, of course, and then I give them to the policymakers. And my goal is to give them the right and useful information, also in a comprehensible way. And I think it's always a bit, we're looking for information that fit our opinion, of course. So it's a bit one-side information. But as I can give a good example is, I think what the IPCC is doing, so the International Panel for Climate Change, I think they developing information, they examining information, and they give and communicate towards policymakers, for example, towards society. And I think that is really what we want, what we use as information to give to the politicians. These warnings, for example, I think that's a good thing that this exists.
All right, I heard you talk about putting science into a comprehensible way for policymakers. So how can scientists communicate effectively so that scientific advice becomes actionable? I see, Alessandro, you turned your mic on.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's just assuming that we're continuing the same order.
We can.
I think that, well, a couple of points I think it's important to make. One is that, at least for the sort of work that we do, we never work with one single paper, with one single research finding. It just is not what policymakers need most of the time. What we need is a synthesis of knowledge. So we need things like systematic reviews, but also not just technical systematic reviews as happen in many fields, but actually reviews that look at a specific issue from multiple angles, from the angles of multiple disciplines. And for us, this is a very important point, and that's why we work with the SAPIA network of scientific academies that bring together expertise from the natural, social sciences, humanities, engineering, and so on. For example, a topic like biodegradable plastics, which I mentioned earlier, it has, of course, a chemical dimension, an environmental dimension, but also a psychological dimension of how consumers behave. And, you know, if you tell people something's biodegradable, are they going to throw it away more just because they think it's biodegradable? And is there a risk of this creating actually perverse incentives? What are the economics of these? And what are the engineering of sorting different sorts of plastics? So for us, all these different forms of scientific knowledge are important to address the issue. The work throws us problems, not disciplines. So we need to really work across disciplines. And this leads me to the second point, which is that we are not experts. I mean, I'm not an expert of any specific discipline. And I do have colleagues who are experts of certain disciplines, but they're not doing the job they're doing because of their technical expertise. Rather, we are experts of the science policy interface. We're experts of not working with experts and bringing together all these different perspectives and harmonizing them, which is really challenging. How do you deal with multidisciplinary science advice was the topic of a recent webinar we organized, because there's some big challenges there, and it's not easy. And especially when it comes to diverging opinions among scientists. Often scientists from different fields frame the problem differently, and they can come up with different assessments. So how do you present that divergence to policymakers without weakening your case? It's not that scientists cannot agree among each other, but it's true that they cut up the word in different ways. So how do you communicate that uncertainty and sometimes disagreement within the scientific community? I think this is one of the great challenges of our job.
Yeah. Tycho or Naomi, do you have any comments, or maybe you want to talk yourself about how scientists can really communicate effectively to you, I guess?
Yeah, if I just jump in, because I really agree with Alessandro's point about not having a discipline focus. You know, people at UK Parliament and probably in a lot of areas of policy, they don't really care what your discipline background is. If you can tell them something that is useful to them, then they don't really mind where that's coming from, as long as it's credible, of course. But I would also kind of give one really key point that I think is really important about making sure that advice is actionable, is that it needs to have a so what. So, you know, why is what you're saying important to society, or why is it important to an area of policy? So, you know, policymakers are always going to be focused on how the advice that you're giving is applicable to a local or a national or an international community. How is it applicable to what the issue that they're trying to work on? So if you can explain that, and if you can ideally give a recommendation or two, it becomes much more likely to become actionable, because that policymaker doesn't have to make the leap themselves. You know, you've explained to them why what you're saying is applicable and what action needs to happen. So you've done a lot of that job for them, and you know, you're the expert, so you could be recommending what you think needs to happen. And the way that you explain that, the phrase that we always use is you should try and explain as if you're talking to an intelligent and interested non-expert. So you don't expect the person you're talking to have the same level of expertise in your field as you do, but you know, they are intelligent, they are interested, they want to know. So just try and pitch it to a non-expert audience and you'll do pretty well.
Okay. Tycho, do you have some tips, or how do you communicate? I know you're from a science background, so how do you communicate to the policymakers?
Yeah, good question. Firstly, I think I'm liking the ideas of Naomi and Alessandro about this multidiscipline. I also like the idea of like looking for example, for plastic was the example that you're also investigating the behavior scenario, because you have scientific arguments, of course, but then you also have economical arguments, behavior. It's all necessary to prove your point. When I would suggest something, I would say that you can choose your own medium or way of expression towards kind of different target groups, because when you're speaking with society, that's a whole other medium, of course, or expression way than towards policymakers. What I'm doing is mostly of the time writing position papers from, for example, a two-pager with a lot of information, the key points, and then sometimes a bit longer for have some background information. What I wouldn't suggest is like the abstracts from papers, for example. I think they're lacking information to give towards the policymaker, because you can't always estimate what's inside the paper. Of course, this is an introduction, but what are the consequences for policy? That is not something that is really indicated in the abstract. So maybe there's something that you can write beside the paper. What would with like policy recommendation or something.
A short recommendation with every paper that says this is for the policymakers.
Maybe.
Okay. Alessandro, I see you've raised your hands. Do you have any comments?
Yes, I want to make one point following up on what Naomi said in the general discussion, which is elaborating a bit on who the policymakers are and sort of like how we imagine this audience, because policymakers can mean many different things. It can be politicians, which is often the case, for example, in the parliament, as Naomi was saying. I guess your main target is members of the parliament and their assistant. But for us at the Commission, often a lot of the work is done by policy officials, so civil servants, and that's the same in most governments. And those are also policymakers in a way. They're not the ministers, they're not the one who have the ultimate say, but they're the one who do all of the legwork. And these people tend to be, highly educated, not necessarily in scientific fields, but they tend to be fairly smart people, but also terribly busy people who often end up working on different topics every 6 months or 1 year. So as Naomi said, you should not expect them to be experts in the field, but you should also not underestimate the level of sophistication that the policymakers can have. And even politicians, I mean, despite all the stereotypes, it should be given credit that they're, most of the time, they're just incredibly busy people who are trying to juggle lots of different demands. So yes, as a scientist, you should try to make things simple, but not dumb them down. And also do not underestimate the level of uncertainty that policymakers and the general public are willing to accept and deal with if things are communicated to them properly. And I think the key point is about being honest. Don't underplay uncertainty because you think it will make things too complicated, because this is going to bite you back later. So it's better to be very upfront about the things that you know and the things that you don't know, or the things that you know with different degrees of certainty. It's not easy, but it really pays off, because also builds trust, which is fundamental in this sort of relations.
Okay, well, that would play right into my next question, is how scientists best communicate the uncertainties of their research. Because I think in the past year we've seen a lot of changes made in a couple of measures concerning the pandemic. This was all made, you had to wear a mask or maybe not, and so a lot of scientists suddenly had to give a lot of information really fast to policymakers, whichever they were. But so how good was it that they, or how do scientists best communicate the uncertainties there? Like you said, they should be very upfront, but should that be like the main message then, the uncertainty, or how do they best incorporate that in their message?
Well, from my side, I would say two things, one more institutional and one more personal. So the institutional one is that we actually did a large study specifically on this a few years ago, called something like providing science advice to policymakers under conditions of uncertainty, where the science advisor make a number of recommendations about how to go about doing science advice in these conditions. And a lot of these concern the openness, the frankness, the transparency, and sort of like engaging early on with policymakers. So I can put the link in the chat and you can have a look. But I would say more generally, this is more my own personal view. I think that a lot of this has to do with the image of science that we as a society build, and that the politicians and the scientists project, because there is often a push and pull between this idea of science as certain, and sometimes politicians demanding certainties from science, often as a way to shield themselves from criticism, because they can say, well, I've just been following the science and the science told me that, and if things turn out to be different, then the scientists were wrong and we should criticize the scientists. But also the scientists have been perpetuating often this idea that science gives certainties because it's a way, it's something that gives them epistemic authority over other forms of knowledge, over pseudoscience and other things. So I think we really need to collectively work more on the proper role of science in society and policy, which is an important one, but not one which is above everything else. It's one which has limits, and these limits need to be acknowledged. But as I said, this is very much my own personal views, and probably here's my philosophy of science background that raises its head.
Naomi, would you care to comment on this?
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting points from Alessandro, and I think that we see the big headlines from politicians which are stating facts without nuance, and I think then we just assume that that's what politicians do. When we look at the work going on that we see less of at Parliament, so I'm thinking about parliamentary select committees who will kind of be a group of politicians supported by parliamentary officials, those parliamentary staff who are going to sit and consider a lot of different evidence, a lot of different views and opinions. If you kind of look at the staff, the officials at Parliament who are providing briefings for politicians, so people working in Post in my own team and people working in the House of Commons and House of Lords libraries, there is a huge understanding of uncertainty here and a willingness to accept it. And I think that a lot of that kind of nuance can actually be quite well communicated. And, you know, obviously politicians might not like uncertainty, but I think they understand it if it's presented in the right way. Yeah. So just kind of a few ways that Post presents uncertainty in research briefings. So Post kind of synthesizes evidence on particular topics and provides it in an impartial way for MPs and Lords to use. And the way that they look at uncertainty is some things like you could present a range. So it could be between X and Y. And then if it's relevant, you can say what the reason for that uncertainty is. If there's an uncertainty because of lack of evidence, then Post would always say that. They'd always say there is insufficient scientific evidence to say conclusively whether X. And if there's maybe disagreements or if there's limitations to the research, then again, they would say that. They would say, so the majority of studies say X, but some say Y. Okay. So I think that those kind of things can be quite easily understood by policymakers, and it's a way of communicating that there's maybe a lack of clear-cut fact, but you should still say it exactly as Alessandra says. You shouldn't kind of cover up that uncertainty, but actually try and present it as a range or explain why the uncertainty is there.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Tycho, do you have any more comments to add to this?
Yeah, I like that idea of the range, because in my policy area, I see a lot of ranges about, for example, emerging technologies in industry, when they're going to be commercial, when they are payable, for example, a price between 100 and 200, but that's normally based on other literature, and it's almost all the time estimation, so it's very, very difficult. But then when you see those numbers appear in other, like for example, news articles or headliners from the politicians, then yeah, you can do nothing about it. I think it's our task to communicate honestly, because in our world we are a bit biased. Of course, we only choose, so it's a bit of cherry picking. We only choose the numbers that fit our story, but that's what the other federations, the industry federations, do also, but from another point of view. So if they do the same like us, you have like completely different numbers against each other. So what gonna choose? What's a politician gonna choose? It's difficult. Yeah, that's it's a hard question, of course.
Maybe Tycho, we can stick with you for a bit. I would actually like to get to know a bit more about recent cases you've worked on. So if you have a specific example where you can show how science evolved to policy making in that case.
Yeah, of course. It was already indicated in the announcement. It's about PFOS pollution, which is a chemical substance. I think in Flanders, they discovered PFOS pollution. PFOS is perfluorooctane sulfanic acid. It's a very difficult name to pronounce. And they found it during construction works in Antwerp. So Antwerp is a major big city in Belgium. And at a certain moment, we were informed or warned by two environmentalists, and they say, look, there is a pollution here. They saw that somewhere in literature, Norwegian literature. They found PFOS in some seals in the Scheldt in Antwerp. But at that time, we didn't know anything. Local government didn't know anything. Nobody knew anything. So that's really bizarre, because how do you can find information if none is available, of course. So you need to dive into this story and the science and the chemistry. We talked to toxicologists about the consequences, because PFOS is like toxic. It could harm you. Yeah, it's a higher risk at cancer, for example, troubles with endocrine system, hormonal troubles. But as an environmentalist, I didn't know at the time what all the troubles are. It's persistent, which means that it stays in the environment or in the body, and it's non-biodegradable. So it's it will not leave the body, and it's given through by breast milk. It's very, very harmful. But at the time, I'm talking about 2010, for example, 2005. None of that was known. because science was changing. Now the norms, for example, for health, for the uptake for your body is like 2,000 times stricter than in 2000. So that is something that scientists needs to find. Mainly here, the trouble is that they didn't update the norms for this kind of construction works, and that it is a dangerous place. So it was also hard to find some evidence on what the PFOS norms were, or the PFOS values were in the blood of people in the neighborhood. And we found a PhD thesis from 2010 from a PhD student who was investigating PFAS in the blood, and she presented that at several conferences, but in fact nobody listened to her. It was really bizarre. International position, Belgium was known for PFOS, but at the local government, the government from Flanders, they decided not to communicate about the health consequences, not about the pollution. But it was really shocking to see that the norms from science were evolving that fast, and that the 3M, which is the company that produces PFAS, could still produce PFOS at norms from like 10 years ago. So I think science really was necessary to solve this case, or will be necessary to solve the case, because now the negotiations are going on to put the norms like the proposal from the European Commission, or the EFSA, which is the European Health Safety for Food. So yeah, that was a case. That's still a case where I'm working on.
Well,
but
very interesting. Yeah. It's really cool to see that you use a PhD thesis. I think a lot of people in this room now will be very excited that their research.
Yeah, it was the only evidence. It's crazy. Yeah.
Well, that's really amazing. Naomi, do you have a case that you will want to share in 5 minutes or something?
Yeah, it's pretty different from Tico's, I think, because I wanted to give you an idea of how contributing to something kind of quite broad or quite overarching can actually shape a kind of policy agenda. And so I just wanted to tell you about what we did in March 2020. So obviously right at the start of the COVID-19 outbreak, and I'm sorry to use an example about COVID when it's not what we all want to hear about all the time. But we kind of thought really carefully at that time about how we're going to try and get expertise around COVID-19 into Parliament. Like there's so many aspects of the way that it's going to affect not only health, but society and welfare and you know, so many different aspects of it, of the world. So how can we get this expertise into Parliament and accessible to the people who need it? So we set up a database for experts in any aspect of the COVID-19 outbreak to register. So we had about 5,000 people register as having some kind of expertise or knowledge in that area. We surveyed them to say, what do you think are the short and the medium and the long-term issues that you can see emerging here? And those responses turned into 20 themes, which became kind of areas of research interest for Parliament. So then we had these kind of 20 themes that lots of committees at Parliament and staff working on research briefings and things were kind of able to see were the most important things that experts thought Parliament should be looking at. And any kind of experts could contribute research into a repository on any of the themes. So they could say, actually, I've got this research, or I'm doing this research, or I've got this expertise and it relates to this theme. So, you know, that might be transport and supply, or it could be mental health, or, you know, anything really. And then committees at Parliament, parliamentary staff, other parliamentary kind of research services could search the database for experts. They could search for the research that had been contributed. The committees could look at those themes that had been identified to choose the topics they wanted to run inquiries on. And kind of briefing services could draw topics for parliamentary briefings from that list of themes as well. So I think that's just kind of an example about how those kind of little opportunities to contribute to policy, you might think your voice is just this kind of drop in the ocean, and maybe you're not an expert on it, maybe you don't feel confident to contribute, but actually, you know, all of those thousands of people who contributed to that kind of survey and that we have been able to shape the topics and the themes that some of the parliamentary staff and committees have been working on related to COVID. So I think it's an example that I hope really encourages you to take up those opportunities, even if they seem a bit small.
Okay, thanks. Alessandro, would you like to share a case that you've worked on in the recent times?
Yeah, maybe, I mean, I can say like a bit of a reflection that for us, the way we work tends to be on the long term. So one of our projects usually has a lifetime of maybe like a year and a half or so, which is rather long, but there is a reason for this. And the reason is that we work very much upfront to make sure that there is a clear request from policymakers for advice. So that the project on biodegradable plastics I worked on that I mentioned earlier, this request came from the Environment Commissioner at the European Commission because of a previous report that chief scientific advisors had done on microplastics, which in turn was originating from a previous work on food from the oceans. So there was a whole chain basically of scientific advice that led from one to another, from food from the oceans to microplastics in the oceans, but not only, to biodegradable plastics. And basically, when the Commission found itself in the position of having to revise its framework of biodegradable plastics, the Environment Commissioner requested advice to us.
I'm having troubles hearing you. Alessandro, I think disconnected. Maybe, no, I don't hear him at the moment. Maybe we can move on and come back later. I hope that a lot of people are getting interested here in science for policy, and I hope that people want to get involved more.
Can you hear me now?
Alessandro, yes, you're back. Sorry.
Yes, sorry, it's my VPN, which is playing some tricks, so I just deactivated that. Should be fine now.
Okay. Do you want to continue with something?
It's okay. I can continue later. Just I cannot turn on my video. It says I've been deactivated. Oh yes. Okay. Thank you. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. I think that can happen with Zoom all the time. So I hope a lot of people now are getting interested in science policy and want to get involved. So actually, my question to the three speakers is what advice would you give to a scientist who would like to start engaging with the policy process and doesn't know where to start? Naomi, I see you nodding.
I'm nodding because this is something that we give advice on all the time, because we're always trying to kind of support and encourage researchers to work with the UK Parliament. And so, I mean, my very first point that I think you need to do if you don't know where to start is to decide, why do you want to do this? So what do you want to achieve? Because until you know what it is that you want to have happen by trying to work with policy, then you'll be unfocused and you won't really know where to start. So actually one of the hardest bits, but the first bit I would say, is to decide why you want to do this. What is it that you want to have happen by working with policy? And then I think you need to identify the areas of policy which your expertise, your research could feed into. So we mentioned earlier in the webinar about policymakers not necessarily minding what discipline you're from. So I think you have to flip your mindset a little bit, and rather than starting from your research discipline, you need to think a little bit about what area of policy it is that you're trying to feed into. Where does it fit? You know, is it to do with health? Is it to do with technology policy? Is it to do with, you know, online security? Is it to do with I don't know, I was about to say petrol supply, just a bit of a UK thing that's in my mind at the moment. So, you know, you need to think about that kind of, where are you aiming for? What do you want to have happen? And actually that's really the hard bit. From there, you can position yourself to spot opportunities. So you can follow committees or working groups or government departments on Twitter. You can sign up to mailing lists. And you kind of you're in a good position to go for an opportunity when you see it. And there are ways to be more proactive, but I would say do those two things first, and then you can think about the practical steps to take.
All right, thank you. Ticho, what advice would you give to a scientist, and what are the things that scientists should think about when trying to engage?
Yeah, good question. Very necessary also for my job, because I want this interaction between policy officers and scientists, of course, to have some more insights and information. If you want this, then know that we want this too. So it would be something that some mental shift in finding each other, for example. I think policymakers want this information. How can you reach them? Just send them an email, for example. Policymakers in my story are politicians. It could also be staff from their study service that do some research for the politicians themselves. Have some time also for them, because I think when you're writing papers and so on, that is very nice for the scientific community, but not that much for all of the politicians. So organize some meet and greets, pitch your story. Would be half an hour, it's okay, because when you have this interaction, you can ask questions, and then it's not really into the paper that you wrote, but it's more like you can think about the policy implications of your work, and would be good. It's also a working point for me that when we have some information moments with politicians, that we can be on a topic, for example, deep sea mining, which is something that is really in the scientific world that's still examined. What are the effects on that we invite also a scientific person to give some insights from that. So that's also a working point for us, I think. Problem is then maybe that you're framed as an environmentalist, which is not really the case, but we can frame that properly or neutral. And of course, I heard Twitter. Twitter is a source of information that you can see all discussions that are going on Twitter. And it would be good to check also the policy that is going on at the European level, like European Commission's DGs. Follow that. Look what's going on, because that is really policy that is set for a couple of years, and then you could implement this kind of information from the policy side into your work. That's just a suggestion, of course.
Okay.
Follow that.
Alessandro, I've seen you've put something in the chat about a free course. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes. This is a course which has been developed by colleagues at the European Commission Joint Research Center, which is our in-house research centers. It's basically a network of laboratories that work on a whole range of topics, from nuclear to climate modeling to economics. So basically, those are researchers which are directly employed by the European Commission to do research on policy relevant topics. So that's one way to engage, is of course to work for an organization like this, but they also do a lot of capacity building. So they put out this course and this handbook that I put there in the chat, which are aimed at researchers who want to learn how to have more impact with their research. But I wanted to build on one point that Tycho made, which I think that one has to be careful when engaging as an individual scientist, whether you are not actually being an advocate. And if you are, it's fine, but you need to be upfront about it. And there is a fine line between providing scientific advice and advocating for a certain course of action. And I mean, we should keep in mind that science cannot tell you where to go. It can tell you how to get there. But where to go is a political decision. And it's totally fine as a scientist to have political views about the world we should be living in, and have the technical understanding to recommend how to get there. But these two things need to be kept separated, or at least you should be very upfront if you're advocating for something on the basis of your science, but also the basis of your values. And this leads me to a second point, which is that interacting with policymakers as an individual scientist is really difficult, partially because the attention that policymakers can give to individuals is relatively limited, partially because we need to have processes in place to insulate policymakers from excessive influence by individuals who might be advocating. So actually working as part of existing organizations and collective organizations can be more effective than trying to carve your little sphere of attention. So working, for example, through scientific societies and scientific academies, even at a junior level, can actually be a very effective way to interact with policymakers within existing structures, rather than trying to build your own channels from zero. So I would very much recommend, especially early career researchers, to engage with student societies, scientific societies in their field, take part in a committee. This also allows you to develop the skills that will be useful working in science for policy. I mean, we at the Commission mostly work with scientific advisory committees, not individuals. So having that experience is fundamental, and also it's very much the way that we work, and insulates from some of the risks of individual advocacy. The last point I want to make is, keep in mind there's many ways to interact with policy as a scientist. You can do it as a researcher, but also as a professional. So I think the three of us are an example of people who have, to different degrees, research or scientific trainings, but now work in a science for policy role, not necessarily doing research ourselves, but acting as knowledge brokers. And it's a career path you could explore, but it's a different thing than remaining an active researcher and engaging with policymakers as an active researcher. Some of the skills are the same, but in our role, you become much more of a generalist, which requires a sort of like a bit of a different path.
Okay. I heard you talk about the individual and researcher that can be, shouldn't be advocating or what he can, but he should also be honest when he's talking about or her research findings. So how can scientists then know which part of the policy sector they need to engage with? Do I go straight to the Prime Minister? How do we know where to start? Where do we give our science, so to speak?
Well, I will say, again, work within existing structures rather than trying to find necessarily your own path. I mean, I'm a big advocate of division of labor. I think that policy making and science are very complex, and there is space for specialization. Some people specialize themselves in specific disciplines. That's what scientists normally do. Other people specialize themselves in being knowledge brokers. And for example, our role is often knowing what the policy cycle is like on a certain area, and we can help scientists to find the best entry point in a way. So, for example, people with a policy background to act as policy impact officers or something like that. UCL, where I did my PhD, where I'm still doing my PhD, as a policy impact unit, whose job is a bit like a press office. If you as a scientist want to get your research in the news, the worst thing you can do is start contacting journalists randomly yourself. The best thing you can do is probably go through your institutional press office, because they actually know how the media cycle works and when and how to pitch a story. And the same goes for policy making. There is people who know what are the hot policy files of the moment, but also those where there's actually space for, say, maneuver, where scientific advice is useful, and others which might be on everyone's mouth, but actually the big decisions have already been taken, and you're not going to shift the balance much. So yeah, don't try to reinvent the wheel, basically.
Okay. Naomi or Tycho, do you have any comments on this?
I just really agree with that. I think don't try and do it by yourself if you have never done it before, because there are plenty of people around who will be able to help, and whether that's within your own institution or from professional networks or learned societies or whatever the structures are within your discipline or your country. And then equally, there are people like myself, maybe like Alessandro and many other legislatures and executives. There will be people who are kind of knowledge brokering that expertise in. To give you a really key point though, saying that, I think it's really important that everyone understands the kind of fundamental split between a legislature and an executive. It's not always the same in every country, but one of the messages that we are constantly talking about in the UK is that government and parliament are not the same thing. They are different things, and that kind of structure is mirrored in a lot of other countries around the world. So the executive, or the government, are developing policy, they are implementing policy, they are the ones taking decisions about spending and about what policies to bring in, and the legislature, the parliament, is usually there scrutinizing the work of government and scrutinizing that legislation that they want to bring in, and it needs to be passed by parliament before it can be enacted. So I just think perhaps a good place to start is to think about what hat you've got on. Are you thinking about what you want to contribute is about developing a policy, or is it about working with a government to kind of look at how something is working or how it could work? Or is actually what you're doing trying to challenge the government? Are you trying to challenge or scrutinize or hold to account what the government are doing? And if it's the latter, you're probably going to want to go for that legislature or that kind of parliament arena. So you don't need to do it by yourself. I completely agree with Alessandro on that. But I think it's useful to have that base knowledge of those kind of two key parts. And then of course you've got the judiciary as a third part as well, about using and interpreting laws. But I could do you a whole 2-hour-long session on that, so I'll stop.
Okay, Tika, would you like to share your point of view on this?
Yeah, I agree for the biggest part. I think when you're a scientist and you're doing your job from ideology, then you should maybe contact us. For example, when it comes to climate change, you need to contact the federations that are will advocate for the same principles that you are doing. I saw how hard it was to put, for example, the PFAS file that I was presenting, the PFAS on the political agenda, which was really hard. We did it with a research team, and I think it was hard to have some context with the politicians because it was too difficult. We wrote some technical notes because it was really a scientific story about chemistry and about health, and it was too difficult. But at the other hand, I think that local politicians, I can only speak for local politicians because that's what I'm doing. I think they are really accessible. So if you have a good story, you have a good research, then do not hesitate. But that's really on a local scale. Do not contact the European Commission when you're just 25 years old, and you know what I mean. And I think when it comes to local politicians, it's also important to build some long-term relationships that they can relate on your work. That could be starting with some email, and then in the future you can have a longer discussions about your work. But yeah, it's all about this relationship that you're building with the politicians.
Okay, thanks. So I think, do you have any must-reads literature or some must-watch videos that you want that scientists should know before they or to get involved in policymaking? Or is there a particular website that you want to share or that you'd recommend to find opportunities to engage with policymaking?
Well, I guess beside the one I've already put in the chat, the course in the handbook, I will say three things. One is a classic book, The Honest Broker by Roger Pill. It's probably like one of the key readings for anyone who's interested as a scientist to engage with policymakers. It's a very readable book and one that everyone, I think, in the sector is familiar with. so it's academic, but not too academic. So the honest broker. Then the second thing is there is a series of podcasts produced by SAPEA, the Science Academies Network we work with, where they interview a wide range of people working in science advice and science for policy from all different stages of career. And you can find some really interesting stories there. And I can put the link in the chat now. And the third one is there's a journal that I collaborate with, which is called the Journal of Science Policy and Governance, JSPG. And it's a journal run by early career researchers for early career researchers who want to engage in policy. It's a place where you can publish in a peer-reviewed journal your work that's policy relevant, and also organizes a lot of trainings and networking events around science policy. And I will put this resource in the chat.
Awesome, thank you. Naomi, I've seen that you shared a link as well already.
Yes, I've just popped some things in the chat. They're specifically focused on UK Parliament, but I think some of the ideas in there are broadly applicable to other policy areas as well. There's a page on that kind of hub of pages, which is called "What Shall I Do Next?", which is kind of a step-by-step guide to how you start, and it's a little bit refers to what I said earlier. There's some online training videos on there as well, including one about how to write for a parliamentary audience, which I think you could apply to different parts of policy as well. So hopefully that's helpful.
Okay, Tycho, do you have some more links or books that you would recommend to scientists?
I'm afraid I cannot add something because I'm mainly working on the local and regional level.
Yeah.
But I think the sources from Naomi and Alessandro are really interesting for me also. So I will definitely check them.
Well, perfect. That's very good to hear. I think now we still have time to answer some of the questions from the audience. I see that we have one question from Carol Brown. Can you speak a bit on the dynamics of ethics in communicating science via policy and misinformation? I often wonder if specific ideas can be driven, even if evidence-based, to lobby or governance that might not benefit the greater good. Let me just. So I think that's about the ethics in communicating science and misinformation. Does anybody want to share something on misinformation and ethics in communicating science?
Well, one thing I will say, if I interpret the question correctly, I think it's important to keep in mind that once you put something out there, you only have limited control over it. And in a political arena, any piece of scientific evidence or advice will often be used for political ends. So it's not uncommon that scientific evidence is how can I say, used as ammunitions to support a certain position. And there is really nothing you can do about it. You need to accept that that's the way politics work. So say that you do research in some areas of, I don't know, some environmental sciences, and you for a position that you actually don't agree with, say that actually, I don't know, less restrictions on carbon emissions, which you think is actually a very bad idea, unless what is being said is false, in which case you should, try to call it out, then I don't think there's really a lot you can do, even if you disagree with the position. What you can do is make sure that when you put your work out there, you do it in a way that does not lend itself to ambiguities or misuse. At the same time, accepting that you cannot control what people do with it. I know it's not like the greatest answer, but that's what comes to my mind.
Okay.
Yeah, I totally agree with Alessandro. I've had quite a lot of conversations with researchers over the years about the need to go into working in the policy sector with your eyes open and realizing that it's a political arena, and you do lose control perhaps of what you've said, and you may find your research being used by a political party in a way that you don't want it to, or maybe interpreted or used as a soundbite without the nuance that you've put around it. And I think we should probably be honest about that and say that, you know, it does happen. I think a really good idea then is what we were saying earlier about not doing this by yourself, is always making sure that you have got the support of your institution or a professional network or a group of colleagues, so that you know that you can rely on them to kind of back you officially and maybe help you to, you know, mitigate anything that's happened. I really don't want to put people off doing this, but I do think that it's fair enough to be honest about the fact that this is a political environment, and you know, your research or your science could be used in a way that you've not necessarily got control over. So I'd really agree with Alessandra on that.
Alessandra, I see your hand is raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that unfortunately it can get nasty out there. I mean, we've seen it with COVID. If you take the example of Professor Ferguson from Imperial College, the sort of personal attacks he got are, you know, it's horrible, and it's a problem that as a society we should address. But it is something that you should keep in mind, that if you put yourself out there in a political space, you become a public person, basically. And that's something that, again, Roger Pilk, the author of The Honest Broker, has quite a lot to say about, because he has been involved in some quite nasty political attacks in the US Congress that put him off from engaging with policymakers for quite a few years.
Okay. Tycho, do you want to also discuss this, or do you want another question that I got here?
Sure. It's not always that nasty, I think, but I already admit that sometimes, yeah, but that's because we are an NGO, of course. We want to achieve something, that we do sometimes cherry picking, but I think as I have like the scientific background, I'm really careful with it, to not give that much misinformation, to give misinformation, not at all. But I think, yeah, we can play with the uncertainty, and that's what the other parties, the party that comes across you also does. So yeah, that's a difficult thing to solve at this moment. But yeah, that's a role, I think.
Okay, so I hear that sometimes it can get nasty. Okay, that's interesting to know. But what is, do you think, the most common misconception about evidence-informed policy? Are there any misconceptions there? Alessandro, I see your mic is on.
I think that there is still a lot. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I think there's still a lot, this idea around that scientific evidence and science can determine directionality of policy, that the science can tell us what we should do. And I mean, you use the term evidence-informed policy rather than evidence-based policy, which is a term that we're trying to avoid. But I think there is still a lot this conception that I'm a scientist and therefore I know what we should be doing, which is a dangerous position to take, because put yourself above the rest of society. And as I said, again, my own view, but I'm first that science plays a very important role in telling how to get there, but not necessarily, you know, which direction to go, especially when there's trade-offs between different alternatives.
Tycho, I see your hand is raised.
Yes, I wanted to say about science-based policy, for example. That is something that we are looking at, just for the discussion, of course, because you have climate change, you have like science-based targets that are targets that yeah, there could be like a pathway for companies to reduce their greenhouse gases, and then it's based on science, of course. But I don't know if this is something that is accepted by Alessandro or not, because that's something that we're advocating for. Maybe it was.
Maybe I should nuance what I said. I mean, science is very important in establishing a target once you've agreed on the goal. So if your goal is, okay, I want to limit temperature increase,
You're breaking up again.
You know, a level that
You're breaking up again, I think, I'm afraid.
Can help you to is that so broken. Yeah, sorry.
No worries. You want to try without camera?
I can try again. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Yeah, I was saying, so science can clearly tell you what a target should be once you have agreed on a goal. But you know, to use a metaphor, if I'm deciding where to go on holiday and I'm having an argument with my family whether to go to the seaside or the mountain, no amount of facts will help us decide. The GPS cannot tell you whether to go to the mountains or the seaside. But if I'm asking, okay, what's the quickest way to get to the mountains, then yes, the GPS science can tell you that. But the directionality needs to be set based on societal preferences.
Mm-hmm. Naomi, do you have anything to add, or does anybody? Yeah, sorry.
I think I'll just add that I think one of the misconceptions I hear is scientists saying, well, the government think the opposite to what I'm saying, so there's no point in contributing my expertise. And I think maybe I would just want to reiterate the point I made earlier about the different parts of policy and the fact that actually there are legislatures, parliaments who are scrutinizing and challenging the government. So actually there probably is an audience out there for your expertise and your research findings, even if they are not what the government is currently saying. Yes, it's going to be harder to achieve change, and sometimes you do have to wait for the open door, or you have to kind of bide your time a bit until public opinion comes with you. But there's probably going to be someone particularly in a legislature, you know, a parliament kind of environment, who is going to be interested in what you're saying if it's challenging, you know, current opinion.
Okay, thanks. Does anybody have any final comments that they want to share now? Because I think we're nearing the end of our time slot. Then, if not, I would just like to thank the speakers for your informative and interesting discussion and all your points of view. I would like to thank the audience for joining us today. And I would like to remind everybody that this webinar was organized by the Science Policy Working Group of Euroscience. And once again, I would like to invite you to visit the website euroscience.org and let us know if you want to get involved and maybe become a member. So thank you all for joining tonight, and hopefully we see each other again in the future, maybe on another webinar or at the ESOF, the Euroscience Open